Welcome back. While all the headlines seem to be about the budget surplus, it may well have been achieved by compromising Australia's national security. The AUKUS submarines were a big move, but to pay for them, other areas of the defence budget have been cut back. And this is at a time where prominent academics like Neil Ferguson are telling Australia it needs to start taking defence much more seriously. That's especially so with China flexing its muscles across the Pacific. Joining me now is one of Australia's top defence analysts, Peter Jennings, who is a director of the think tank Strategic Analysis Australia. Peter, welcome to the program. It's agreed across both parties that China is a real threat and that Russia, at war with Ukraine right now, makes the world a very unpredictable and sometimes dangerous place. And yet, Australia is not increasing its defence spending in this budget. Why is that?
Well, this, I think, is one of the big surprises of the week, Amanda. I mean, we've known that the defence budget is not going to go up since the release of the Defence Strategic Review, which was a couple of Mondays ago, where the document said that there was no new money for defence, that in fact it was going to remain at the previous government's forecast levels for the next 4 years. And something I think really strange has happened to bring that outcome about. It was certainly the case at the time of the election and probably for the first 6 months of the government being in office that they were talking a big game about defence and security. As you say, we had the AUKUS agreements, we had all of that international travel for the Prime Minister and Richard Marles going to the UK, the US, Japan, saying that in fact this was the most difficult strategic environment that Australia has seen since the end of the Second World War. And so all of the ground was prepared for the strong likelihood of there being defence spending increases being announced in the Defence Strategic Review and then in this budget. And I think what's happened, frankly, is that as it looks as though the government has got closer and closer to delivering the surplus, they've started to look for savings. And just as happened when the government was last in power around 2010, 2011, defence has been one of those departments which has been cut back. And so far from a growth spurt, which people were expecting, what we now have is internal savings, where defence has got to go through some quite significant internal change to find money for programs which would otherwise have required new funding in this budget.
Is this a case of short-term political pressures and political posturing getting in the way of good government and the drive to think long-term?
It's certainly getting in the way of what Australia needs from a security point of view, and this is frankly inescapable. The government has just released a public version of a report by Stephen Smith and former Chief of Defence Force Sir Angus Houston saying that we face very difficult strategic times and that there is absolute urgency that the government has to take to change our defence postures because defence is not fit for purpose. That's the language they use. And then you turn to the back of that Strategic Defence Review report and see there's no money. So I think we're seeing posturing on the delivery of a surplus. And I think there's another thing going on here too, which is Labor is overestimating its ability to manage China. We now have Penny Wong saying we're going to have a stabilised relationship with China. And I think that's leading the government to temper the assessments that it's getting about a very grim strategic situation where China is the major problem. And so for those two factors, I think we end up just getting a non-delivery of what a lot of people might have been expecting, which was growth in defence spending.
I share your view that the early language that was being used by Labor, and in particular Marles, was really encouraging. It suggested that they did take the threat seriously and they understood the challenge they faced, and yet their spending plan seems to reflect greater naivety. Do the left-leaning tendencies of Labor mean that they simply refuse to take an external military threat from a nation that's, notionally from the left, seriously?
Well, I think we've seen some changes of attitude around China, which really coincides with the end of so-called Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy and the aggressive, frankly nasty language that China was using to talk about Australia. All of which happened about the time the Labor government was elected. And instead what we've had is state premiers visiting, which Anthony Albanese has welcomed. And so it does seem hard. I think Labor is really struggling to work out how to think about China. And on the one hand, there are advocates for, the ever-deepening economic dependence that we have on the PRC. And there are those, including Richard Marles, who argue that China presents a major strategic threat in the region. And the government has not worked out how to sort of balance those two objectives. And on the basis of what we appear to be getting just in a few minutes with the budget, you'd have to be saying that those who think China is manageable and not such a risk, they're the ones that won the defence funding debate around the cabinet table this time round.
And finally, are the government doing enough to make Australia self-reliant and self-sufficient in relation to being able to build our own weapons and missiles? I mean, if we face a Pacific battleground, Australia won't be in a position to import military equipment in the traditional way. Are we doing enough to get ourselves prepared and organised?
Nowhere near enough, Amanda. The truth of the matter is, for decades, Australia has significantly underinvested in defence. And we've been able to do it because the United States, as our closest ally, has been the country prepared to carry the burden of security costs in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, that's just no longer sustainable because America is changing its attitude. They want their allies to do more. China is becoming a more immediate short-term threat. And the bad news for Australia is you cannot get away, for a country our size, with a defence spend which is about 2% of gross national product. We, at the moment, have something in the order of 3 or 4% of aspiration for defence spend, with missiles and submarines and all of the things that really should be being done inside Australia, constrained by the reality of a 2% of gross national product budget. And, I can tell you 3 into 2 doesn't go, Amanda. It just will not work. And, governments can sort of struggle to try to walk away from that hard reality. But this is the world that we're facing. And I think this is going to be increasingly difficult for Australian governments into the future, where they will have to spend more on defence, whether or not they want to. And right now it's clear that this government doesn't want to.
Peter Jennings, thank you very much for sharing those insights. I appreciate your time.